All right, we're on lesson number 6 in our Sunday school book as we're continuing this study of the book of Job. And we've got this lesson and one more, and we'll be done with Job then for a little while, however long they'll get us back in it in the curriculum. And we'll be going to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, I believe, something like that after that. But we're on lesson number 6 today, God Answers Job. And it says right under that, God often reveals himself in difficult times. Isn't that something? I think it's very true. It's just the way the life seems to work. We don't seem to learn as much about the Lord in the mountaintops as we do in the valleys. Just the way life seems to work. It's one of those things that we don't seem to grow as much on the mountaintop. But the good thing about it, the difficult times, God doesn't change. He's the same God, as the song said, on the mountain as he is in the valley. The God on the mountain is the God of the valley. When things go wrong, he'll make them right. And we just trust him to do that. And Job certainly had to trust the Lord in the valley. Another song I thought of was, I think it's an old Dottie Rambo song, "In the valley, he restoreth my soul." And of course that goes back to Psalm 23. But I believe Job found that. Even though Job had a hard time he had to go through during this experience, he came out better on the other side. Not that there wasn't loss, not that there wasn't suffering, but he came out victorious on the other side of the trial. So let's look today in the lesson overview. It says God finally responded after 35 chapters, starting with Job 3 and ending with Job 37, of Job and his friends wrestling with the reason he was going through such dreadful disasters. Job rejected his friends' accusations of sin, but then repeatedly asked God to tell him what he had done to deserve this punishment. He practically challenged God to show up and allow him to defend himself. Then when God did show up, that is in a more manifest way, and God spoke, Job put his hands over his mouth and admitted his ignorance. He talked about putting his hand over his mouth. This lesson highlights some of God's response to Job and Job's reaction to God's words. God referred to the things he had done and asked Job if he could do these things or even understand them. And our golden text comes from Job 38, verses 1 and 3. They've got it kind of put together here. And it says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me." And we'll talk about that here some more in this first section in just a brief moment or two. So Job 38 is where we're going. First of all, look at some verses there. And then we'll be looking also in Job 39 and Job 40, should time and the Lord permit. But just a little word of summary. I won't go into quite as much detail maybe as I have, because we've already had quite a few lessons on this. But Job, of course, has had these devastating tragedies happen to him. All the loss that was financial loss and loss of livestock, all that kind of stuff. Loss of his children, 10 children at one time passing away. Also, and I don't know exactly about his wife, how long she stayed in that state that she was in, but she was in that state of just wanting him to curse God and die. And I don't know, so maybe she stayed that way for the whole trial, and that might have been a continuing discouragement to him. I don't know. But he's also in that spiritual pain as well, as we talked last week, I guess it was, about that he couldn't sense God's presence. It's like I look every which direction and I can't find God in the middle of this trial. And so he's in that spiritual sense of pain. Even though God was there, he just couldn't seem to feel God, couldn't seem to sense God or find where he was. And then on top of that, he had those 3 friends that came in and began to point fingers, as we like to say, and accuse him of sin. That Job, this is the reason you're going through this, because there's some sin in your heart, And that just wasn't the case with Job, as we have already stressed in this series. In Job's particular case, it was not because of any sin that he had gone through this trial. And the discourse of Job and his friends, those 3 friends, goes back and forth for 29 chapters. And that takes you up to chapter 31 in the book. Then in chapter 32, there's another man that comes on the scene that they don't have us particularly talking about him, maybe not at all in our book. But chapter 32, another man comes on the scene named Elihu, however you would say his name. And Elihu begins to speak, makes his case for 6 chapters. Quite a lengthy statement that he made. And he was younger, I believe the Bible shows us. And he just thought he ought to wait before he would say a few things. And Elihu comes in and gives his statement. Job never actually answers Elihu. And I personally think that Elihu gets it more right. There's some that think that Elihu still had some, didn't say everything just right, but I think Elihu got it more right. It's interesting that God does not seem to condemn Elihu when he talks about the 3 friends. He talks about Eliphaz and his 2 friends. God was condemning what they had to say, but he doesn't condemn what Elihu had to say. So I get the sense that Elihu got it at least more right. And Elihu seems to stick up for God. He seems to be of the position of, I want God to be represented rightly. I want him to be represented accurately. And so he just wants Job to see God in the right perspective and God to get the glory. But as you get toward the end of chapter 37, it's like Elihu is, as we talk about sometimes, he's setting up God's sermon. Because in the end of chapter 37, Elihu begins to say some things that God, it's like God, when God begins to speak, he kind of picks up on the same theme that Elihu has in the end of chapter 37. So I think that's interesting. But God seems to accept what Elihu has to say to Job. And then we want to look today in this lesson particularly at what God had to say, starting in chapter 38. So let's look at chapter 38 in Job, verse number 1. It says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said. Now that whirlwind there, it seems to be very possibly that this is a literal storm that comes up, some type of a whirlwind or some type of a storm. Another idea is that this was symbolic of the trouble that Job was going through as a whirlwind. But a lot of the commentators will go with that this is a literal storm. So quite possibly this is a whirlwind that comes up. And maybe God's purpose in that is that Job would see that whirlwind. And of course we know if we see a tornado, we know if we see a hurricane or anything like that, it's just a powerful experience if you've ever been involved with anything like that. I have not been involved in the middle of something like that. It's come close here, came 1.5 miles or something the other day, but I've not been in the midst of something like that like some of you, I suppose, have. And but it's a powerful thing, even if you see it, if you're in it, whatever. And so maybe the symbolism of that is to Job that God is powerful. He's mighty. He's majestic. And he comes on the scene and he begins to talk to Job. Comes on the scene in a more manifest way. Notice what he has to say right off the bat in verse number 2. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Well, God knows how to drop the mic, doesn't he? Just come right out and say it. And God's always right when he says it, and so it really is something we need to listen to when God speaks. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? That is probably the biggest statement, or the central focus, you might say, of this whole lesson, that God would answer that to Job. In other words, who is this that's putting darkness over my plan and purposes, you might could say there. That word counsel can be translated as plan or purposes. Who is this that's putting darkness, casting obscurity or confusion over my plan and my purpose by saying things that aren't right? Words without knowledge. And I believe God's talking about Job there when he says that. And in fact, as I was reading in what Elihu had to say right before this, Elihu had made some similar statements about Job already. In Job 34:35, it says, Job has spoken without knowledge, and his words were without wisdom. Job 35:16, therefore doth Job open his mouth in vain. He multiplieth words without knowledge. So Elihu is already picking up on this in Job's life here. And God comes in and says a lot the same thing that Elihu has said. Some things that Job was saying in the midst of this trial. early on, Job had his words going in the right direction. The Lord giveth, the Lord take away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we not receive evil and good at the hand of God? I mean, he had his words going good. He had his what he was saying right at the first. So, but then he begins to go through his trial, and we begin to see some things that we look at and we say, my goodness, that's strong, Job. That's strong against the Lord to say that. And but let me balance this at the same time, okay? And I began to balance it last week based on something Sister Rhonda said. She brought up where he talked about, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I think probably when we look at Job's life, because you get some really good statements from Job throughout this book. You get the one about, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. You get the one about, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. You get the one where he said, but he knoweth the way that I take. When he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. And then in last week's lesson, he said in Job 23:12, neither have I gone back from the commandment of his lips. I have esteemed the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. So let me say this as a balancing statement on what I think Job's heart was. Okay, so we hear the words he's saying, but I don't know that Job always knows that he's saying things that he probably ought not be saying. I think he's in the anguish of the moment. He's in the emotion of the moment, the rawness of those emotions coming out. And I don't know that he's trying to speak against the Almighty. I don't know that he's trying to speak negatively about God, but that's what's coming out. He thinks that he's trying to stay on the straight and narrow. You get over here to the end, and God says you've spoken some things that you didn't know what you were talking about. You've darkened counsel by words without knowledge. And in fact, he says it himself. I have uttered that which I understood not, or something to that effect. And so I think we see the balance here, that Job is saying some things he probably ought not say, but he doesn't necessarily realize it. He's trying to keep his heart in the right direction. Sister Gore.
I think that it's okay. Sometimes we want to know why, but we can want
Right.
to know that without complaining.
Right, yes. Right. I do think that we can ask God questions as long as we don't get into, like you say, the complaining mode. As long as we don't get into the charging God foolishly type of a mode, But yeah, questions are right. We just trust him if he'll answer or not, because he may not tell us what the reason is. But yeah, I think it's all right to ask. But I think we see the balance in Job's life there. He doesn't always realize, it seems, the things that he's saying. And you say, well, does that permit us to say things that we ought not say during our trial? No, it doesn't. But let me tell you what I want to focus on there. God's mercy is evident here to see Job's heart in what he was going through. Because I think we see his heart when he says, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I think we see his heart when he says, I know that my Redeemer liveth. When he says, he knows the way I take, all that kind of stuff. I think we see Job's heart as he's trying to do it right. He gets a little wobbly sometimes in what he's doing. But I think I know that God sees his heart. And so he shows him mercy. And I believe it's the same way with us. There is a difference. Let me give you an example here. If your child, your own blood child, says, there's two different situations going on. If they're being rebellious and they say, don't do that to me, or whatever, that's an attitude that's got to be dealt with, okay? As you're trying to raise your child, that's not going to happen. But if they are in fear and in anguish, and they've got a big old gash on their knee, and you're trying to put solar cane or whatever on that they're afraid is going to hurt, and they say, don't do that to me, there's a difference, isn't there? Because they're not trying to be rude necessarily. They're just they don't understand what's going on. Maybe they're afraid. They're trying to get through a hard time, and their heart. That's what a good parent does. They know their child's heart. And if they see a problem in the heart, a rebellion springing up over here, then they say, okay, we got to deal with this. But if they say, no, he was just in a hard time, he didn't necessarily understand what he was saying there in that time. And I may come back later and say, we really should try to be careful when we, even when we're in pain. Don't say things that are harsh, But there's going to be a different manner you deal with them depending on what you believe their heart is. I believe God sees Job's heart here. He's got some things he needs to address with Job. And he's going to come in here and say a lot of things that are very strong. But it's different because the three friends, think about this. The three friends, he comes out right in the end and condemns. But there's just basically, he corrects them at least. But Job, he deals with him and then he blesses him more in his latter end than he was in his beginning. That's a God of mercy right there. That's a God of mercy. He knew Job's heart. Okay, but he's telling him, you're darkening counsel, you're muddying up my counsel by words without knowledge. Now, look at verse 3. He says, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. It's the idea there of putting yourself in a courageous, battle-ready stance. Gird up thy loins like a man. A commentator said the robe, usually worn flowing, was girt up by a girdle when men ran, labored, or fought. So it's kind of, you're getting yourself ready. It's a battle stance. And God is going to put Job to the challenge here. And, Job's been wanting to talk to God. He's been, boy, I wish I could find him. I'd present my case before him. Probably the case of why he thought that maybe he shouldn't deserve this, or maybe why he thought he was innocent, all this kind of stuff. And so God's coming to him. God's going to speak first, but he's coming to him, and there's going to be an opportunity that Job would answer what God had to say. Verse 4, God says to Job, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. That's worth just meditating on a little bit right there. Job, you've been saying things that are kind of presumptuous about me. You think you could run things better. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? It's true. God is almighty. God has created this place. God's the one that runs this place. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made, talking about the Word there, Jesus in John 1. And all things consist by him. All things are through him, to him, and does it say for him or of him? I know somewhere maybe in Hebrews. But anyways, it's all about him. It's all upheld by him. It was all made by him. And Job has an idea that maybe things should have been a little different. And so God comes in and says, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. I got my notes here. This is an example. Talking about the things that Job would say that was a little bit, is kind of strong. In Job 30, 21, or 20 and 21. Job 30, 20 and 21. I cry unto thee, and thou dost not hear me. I stand up, and thou regardest me not. Thou art become cruel to me. With thy strong hand thou opposest thyself against me. That's pretty strong right there, okay? Again, I don't know that Job necessarily is trying to be ugly at God. I don't know that he's necessarily trying to be. But he comes across with things that he really shouldn't be saying. But God says, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Well, he hadn't even been thought of with his parents. His parents hadn't even been thought of. You're talking about thousands of years, or a long time at least before this. Even though Job lived early, it's at least a long time before this when God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 5, who hath laid the measures thereof? If thou knowest, or who hath stretched the line upon it? That line, the idea of a measuring line, or a tape measure, you might even say, that we would think of today, something similar. Job, who was it that measured out the earth? Who was it that laid out this world? God, or Job, did you make the architect plans, so to speak, for this earth? Did you measure it out? Something to that effect. Well, skip down to verse 18. Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? Declare if thou knowest it all. The breadth being the idea of the width. And of course, that's apparently something that nobody knew in that day. Of course, now with technology and everything, they can kind of measure the earth and get an approximate dimension. But in that day, that was just God. that knew that. The breadth of the earth, all the dimensions and so forth you could think about there. But the breadth of the earth he specifically mentions here. Declare if thou knowest it all. Where is the way where light dwelleth? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof, and that thou shouldest know the paths to the house thereof. The house talking there apparently about the dwelling place of darkness. In other words, I think God is basically saying, Job, are you able to go where light and darkness are and make it do what you want it to do? In other words, are you able to make the sun rise and sunset? Are you able to make the darkness come upon us, the night to fall and the morning to appear? No. No. Only God can do that kind of stuff. So he's really giving perspective here to Job. Verse 21, knowest thou it because thou wast then born, or because the number of thy days is great? In other words, Job, were you born when I created all this? Were you old enough to know about this or created the darkness? Whatever he's mentioning specifically there. The number of thy days great. God's just bringing it into perspective, helping Job to understand how much bigger and wiser that God is instead of Job. Okay, go to 39 now. We'll keep going. Job 39 and verse 26. Doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom and stretch her wings toward the south? Job, did you give the instincts to that hawk to know how to fly and stretch her wings toward the south, Job? That's a pretty amazing thing to me. You think about all the birds, the hawks, whatever, robins, whatever, all the birds that would fly south for the winter. How do they know how to do that? Did they go to bird flight school? I mean, did they do something to get trained up in the academy of the outdoor world? No, God did that. God did that. He put it in them when he created them. They just know. Like how does a dog know to do all the things it does? I mean, you can train them a little, yeah, but God put those instincts in there. God put that know-how in that animal, that dog, that cat, that bird, whatever it is. The hawk. It wasn't by Job's wisdom that the hawk knew how to fly and stretch her wings toward the south. Verse 27. Doth the eagle mount up at thy command and make her nest on high? No, it's God's command, that eagle being able to mount up. It's understood, as I was studying on this, it's understood that the eagle is able to set up it'll go up in a high place and set. A lot of you probably know more about it than I do, but an eagle will go up in a high place and set, and it has such good eyesight that it can see its prey for a long ways away. And it can go and dive in and get its prey that it wants to get. Job didn't do that. None of us did that for those eagles. God is the one that made the eagle so fearfully and wonderfully made, you might say. So, it wasn't Job that commanded the eagle, make her nest on high, all that kind of stuff. She dwelleth and abideth, the eagle that is, on the rock, upon the crag of the rock, and the strong place. The crag of the rock being a cliff. The cliff of the rock, understood to be a place of safety. The eagle knows how to get there and be in a place of safety. And then it says in verse 29, from thence she seeketh her prey, and her eyes behold afar off. So see, there's that idea there of the eagle being able to see a long ways. Just amazing how God has made them. And apparently the eagle is a bird that can go way up high and have great strength as it flies, because God commands the strength that he is able to give to us as we wait upon the Lord is like the strength of the eagle. You'll mount up with wings as eagles. You'll run and not grow weary. You'll walk and not faint, because we're waiting upon the Lord. Verse 30, talking about the eagle still. Her young ones also suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is she. Understood there to be talking about the way the eagle feeds upon dead bodies like a vulture would. And it may not be all, there may be certain types or something, no, I don't know. But anyways, it talks about that here, how that they'll feed upon dead bodies. The young ones, it seems that the blood will get back to the young ones, that way they can have sustenance or whatever. But anyways, the idea there is that it's wonderful and amazing and marvelous how that God has made the animal kingdom. It's wisdom that's above us. Job didn't do it. None of us did it. No human has ever done it. But God did it. And he just spoke it into existence. He just did it. I mean, it's nothing to him. I heard Chuck Swindoll talking about when it's talking about the creation. And I forget which day it is. But when he made the stars, I get maybe the sun and moon on the same day. I can't remember. But Genesis 1 maybe would be where that would be found. Or 2, somewhere right there. Maybe 1. And it talked about there, it just says simply, if you think about all the stars we have, it just says simply, something like this, and he made the stars also. That's all it says. You talk about all those stars up there, Chuck Swindoll said if we had created stars, we would write books about creating stars. I mean, he said, but when you're great, it's not a big deal. And he made the stars also. That's the same way it is with any of our lives. He can just cause something to happen just like that. No big deal. He's that powerful. He's that almighty. He made the stars also. Just flung them into space, you might say. Spoke them into existence, however you want to say it. He spoke them into existence is what he did. So, let's see. Verse 30, we already read that one. Okay, so we're going into chapter 40 now. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, here's another mic drop statement. Shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer it. Okay, so the word contendeth there is the idea of striving with or debating with. You know, he has wanted to have this audience with God and be able to present his case. And he's been saying these things. And it's like he wants this courtroom scene kind of before God to make his appeal or make his case before God. And God's now saying to Job, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? In other words, Job, in the midst of your striving with me, do you think you have something you can reprove me about? Do you think you have something that you can instruct me about? The word reproveth it says down there, he that reproveth God, let him answer it. The word reproveth is the idea of correcting or rebuking. Job, do you have something that you can correct me about? Something you can rebuke me about? Okay? A commentator said this, there is now an opportunity for him to carry his cause as he wished directly before God. Is he ready to embrace the opportunity and to answer now what the Almighty has said? Well, he was ready, but he was more ready now than he'd ever been maybe about how to answer God. Verse 3, then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. And here's what I've been talking about. What shall I answer thee? Here it is. I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. No big old defense argument then. No big old laying his case out before God. He says, behold, I am vile. The word vile means I am unworthy or I am insignificant. I am nothing. Not only his humility there of being insignificant, realizing he was, but maybe going even so far as to say, I am sinful. I have committed acts against God in the midst of this trial. Once he encountered God, he realized how big God was and how little he was. He realized how wise God was and how small his own wisdom was. He realized how insignificant he was compared to God. And he just says, I will lay mine hand upon my mouth. He realizes he don't need to say anything now. He's said enough. He needs to just submit himself to God. This is, I believe, an act of humbling himself, an act of submitting himself to the lordship of God, but then also possibly admitting his own inability to answer the questions that God has put forth for him, other than if it maybe would just be with a, no, I can't do that. You know, and there, as you read through there may be some more that it would just be, I don't know what to say, as you look through the things that God had said. But he realizes he don't need to say anything, just lay his hand over his mouth. He says in verse 5, once have I spoken, but I will not answer. Yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. In other words, I'm just going to stop talking. I just need to proceed no further with what I have been saying. Verse 6, Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind, and said, Gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. So again, it's that idea of being battle ready. He's wanting Job to be prepared, putting Job to the challenge. Here's another, boy, God's on it, isn't he? He's got another mic drop statement right here in verse 8. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? That deserves a little silence there, doesn't it? My goodness. The word disannul there, it's the idea of making void or bringing to naught. You might think like the disannulling of a contract or of a marriage or something like that in today's world. It's to cause something to cease. And the idea here of God's judgment is His working in Job's life. His dealings, the way that God has operated and allowed things to happen in Job's life. In other words, it's kind of like He's saying, Job, will you dissolve my workings in your life as though they were wrong? Will you disannul my judgment? It's kind of like God saying, Job, who are you to look at my dealings in your life and say, God didn't do it right? Who are you to say that? It's kind of like, I was thinking about this, it's kind of like God saying that Job is basically, in the things that he's been saying, it's like that he has taken, this is God's dealings, these papers, you just imagine, are God's dealings in Job's life. I'm not going to do it, but it's like he's taking it and going, that's not right. That's what Job is implying in what he's saying. And God is recognizing that, and He's saying, Job, basically, who are you to do that with the way I operate in your life? Who are you to disannul my judgment? Then He says, wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? That's a heavy statement right there. Job, will you lay the blame on me so that you can look good? Commentator said this, Job had allowed himself to use language which strongly implied that God was improperly severe. He had regarded himself as punished far beyond what he deserved, and as suffering in a manner which justice did not demand. It was a charge of such a nature that it could not be passed over in silence. And God asks, therefore, with emphasis, whether Job now supposed that he could institute such an argument as to show that he was right and his Maker was wrong. Can't do that. It's not possible. Because God, as for God, His way is perfect. As for God, His way is perfect. Nothing wrong about what He does. God never has a bad day. God never responds too harshly. God never overreacts. God never underreacts. He's just right. Wouldn't it be great if we as humans could be that way? Wouldn't it be great if something could come to us and our, sometimes that sense of displeasure or of a sense of anger will rise up in us and we'll have a reaction. And then it's like, will I ever learn? Will I ever learn? God doesn't have to learn. He knows how to react right every time. And that's why we can feel safe with Him. That's why we can trust Him even when we don't understand. And that's going to be, Monday night in our Bible school, there's going to be something about that, about being obedient to God even when you don't understand. Because sometimes there's just going to be things when we're dealing with God, when we're serving Him, that are going to be above our pay grade, going to be above our knowledge. He says that His ways are higher than ours, His thoughts are higher than ours. There's just going to be some things when we are serving God that we won't understand. But yes, go ahead. That's right. That's right. We're limited in our understanding. We can only understand so much. And God's understanding is infinite. There's no top. There's no lid on His understanding. And He is the one we have to trust. We don't need to condemn Him so that we can save our face and claim that we are still righteous. We just need to trust Him no matter what. Verse 9, he said this, Hast thou an arm like God? Or canst thou thunder with a voice like him, an arm like God. The arm is the idea, it seems, of God's power. The arm of God symbolizing his power. Job, are you as powerful as God? Are you all powerful? Because God is all power. He's omnipotent. All power belongs to him. Jesus said something to the effect of, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. And they're both God in the Godhead, Jesus and God the Father. Do you have an arm like God? And then he also said there, canst thou thunder with a voice like him? One commentator said, God can both overpower and outvoice men, and therefore it is vain to oppose him and contend with him. That's right. His voice is powerful. His voice is like thunder, and that's why we need to listen to it. And here's the thing about, let me push on that again about him being always right. You have probably known some people that had, humans is what I'm saying, that have had a voice like thunder. And maybe it was a father, maybe it was a grandfather, but that particular kind of attitude in a human, if it's not done with godliness, it can create a sense of tension in the family, a sense of fear, and a sense of walking on eggshells in the family because there's somebody in the house or somebody in the vicinity that is not godly and has a voice like thunder. That's bad when it's like that. You don't want somebody that's not going to do it right with a voice like thunder, because then you get a lot of wounded and messed up people in the world. And that's what we've got today. I don't remember the numbers, maybe specific. I'll try to remember them pretty close. But I was hearing a preacher talking about the fathers. That there can be women with a thundering voice too, but most of the time, if it's an ungodly thing, it'll be the men a lot of times in the world. But a preacher was talking about the fathers in the world that, I forget the numbers maybe specifically, but this is maybe pretty close. 60% maybe? 60% of all people maybe it was in the United States, grew up either without a father or was gone most of the time or something like that. Basically, the father's presence was gone. Maybe that's how it was. 60%. You think about that. That's a lot. 60% of people in the United States. The other 40%, like 75% of the 40%, had an abusive father or a father that wasn't there or something like that. I'm getting my numbers a little confused, or my facts a little confused here. It was a huge number. And it came down to what his figures were, it was like about 5% of men in the United States are a godly father. You think about that. 5%. You've got a lot of people that are living life with the scars and the wounds of somebody that put a bad light. This is another aspect. Put a bad light on what God was. Because that, I believe, is one of the father's responsibilities, is to give the kids the right impression of what the Heavenly Father is like. I believe that's part of the father's role. Now, he's not God, I'm not saying that. But he is in a place where that person can know how to relate to God the Father based on, if it's done right, based on how they related to their earthly father. But when you've only got 5% that are doing it right, you're in a bad place in the world. But the good news is we have a God that does have a voice like thunder, but it's always right. It's always right. Have you ever known let's just go with a man, because God, we think of that, and he's we say he with him in male. So think of a man. Have you ever known a man that had a voice like thunder, but had godliness attached to it? And it was a good thing. And it's like you want him to be in your corner, because he's going to stand up for what's right. He is going to defend you. He's going to protect you. And he's going to help you to be guided in the right way in life. That's a godly man with a voice like thunder, authority in his voice. Then that's a good thing. That is a helpful thing. That is something that we enjoy to have in our life because it makes us secure, makes us feel safe. Well, that is exactly what God is, only with no room for mistakes. No room for mistakes. He has a voice that is like thunder. And then in this 10 through 14 here, basically, God is saying to Job, can you do all these things? And he mentions different things. Or when you do these things, then I'll admit something to you. Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold every one that is proud and abase him. In other words, do the work of God. Do the work of God that's always right. Have majesty and beauty like God, all that kind of stuff. Look on every one that is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. Maybe talking about death or toward death right there. He said, basically, if you can do all that, Job, then will I confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. Well, the answer had to be, I can't do all that. Can't do any of that. Only God can bring the proud down and make them low. Only God can have that glorious majesty and glory and beauty and excellency. Only God can tread down the wicked in their place. All the weapons of our warfare, if we try to use the carnal ones, we're going to get in trouble. We're going to get in trouble. It's got to be God that takes down our enemies. It's got to be God that brings the proud down low. We cannot do it. And so, really what it comes back to, and what God, I believe, was implying there to Job was, Job, since you can't do all that, you just need to trust me that can. You just need to trust me. God could take care of those 3 friends that were acting basically as enemies to him. God could get his wife back on track. God could bless him in wonderful ways. God could take care of everything. Deliver him out of his troubles. Save it. All that kind of stuff. God could take care of that. And he just needed to trust God. Really what it comes back to is trusting God and holding on to his hand. And thought about a song, and I don't really know it, but I looked it up a little bit. And it says something like this. I'm going to try to sing it, and I don't know if I'll get all the words right. I don't need to understand. I just need to hold his hand. It says something like, I don't ever need to ask the reason why. And it's like we say, it's okay if we do, but just don't demand the reason why. For I know he'll make a way. Something, blah, 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 blah. I don't need to understand. I just need to hold his hand. That's the truth of the Bible. Even we can ask God, we trust him, whether he'll give us the answer or not reveal it. But the big thing is, just trust him. Through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. Learn to trust in God. And he will get us through. If we'll just stay on his side, keep our hand in his, do what he says, he'll get us through anything that we have to face. I guarantee it. Amen? Amen. All right, that's all for today. We got one more lesson on Job, and we'll see some of Job's reaction next week. God bless you for being in Sunday school. We'll take a break, start service in just a few minutes.